All right, hey everyone, we're back now for the second part of our lecture on oxygen and carbon dioxide physiology, so getting principles of gas exchange. And just to recap from the last lecture and video, you should, by this point, have a good sense of how gases actually move and how to determine which direction a gas will travel. And you should be thinking both about air-to-air movement and also about air-to-water movement. And then along with that, what three things do you really have to know to calculate the concentration of a given gas in a given volume of water? All good things to think about. Let's now think about a scenario to apply some of what we've been talking about. Here's a scuba diver who is underwater. And let's just imagine the scuba diver is about 20 meters underwater. If you have ever gone diving, you might realize that as you go deeper, right, the pressure around you increases. So it doesn't take too deep to start experiencing higher and higher pressures. So we can imagine that this diver at this depth of 20 meters could be experiencing something like 3 atmospheres worth of pressure. Right, so she's breathing from a tank. That tank is a mixture of gases. And so as she is breathing at this depth, the nitrogen partial pressure that's being delivered to her lungs and blood, right, the gas mixture is 78% nitrogen, will be 2.3 atmospheres. Okay, so she's going to reach an equilibrium with the nitrogen gas that's being delivered to her lungs and blood. So my question to you is, what will happen if this diver suddenly heads for the surface, and why? Right. So if we now think about conditions at the surface, the sea level has an air pressure of 1 atmosphere, and that means that at sea level, the partial pressure of nitrogen is going to be 0.78 atmospheres. Right. Nitrogen is a gas, so it will behave similarly to other gases. It's going to move down its partial pressure gradient. Right, so that's a pretty substantial partial pressure gradient, right, from 0.78 atmospheres. Or from 2.3 atmospheres to 0.78. So what that means is if she comes back up to the surface, all of a sudden, there's a lot of nitrogen gas in her blood that is going to head back into the gas phase, right? And so it will actually form small gas bubbles throughout her tissues and throughout her bloodstream. Right, and that is a condition that we now know of as the bends. It can be painful, and it also, depending on where those gas bubbles form, it can be lethal. Right, so anyone who has any experience diving will have a very vivid memory of when you dive, you cannot come back to the surface quickly. Right, you need to come back gradually so that you don't experience an extreme partial pressure gradient, and you can just breathe out the extra nitrogen that has dissolved into your blood. And if someone does wind up needing to come back to the surface quickly, usually what will then happen is they'll be taken somewhere with a pressure chamber so that they can be repressurized and then gradually depressurized, right, to help them cope with the bends. But it can be fatal. So now, you've been taking biology classes for a little while, and so hopefully you've heard a thing or two about a molecule found in mammalian blood, and we'll talk about some alternatives pretty soon, right? The molecule hemoglobin, which we know as a molecule important for carrying oxygen. So you might have the question of, how does hemoglobin factor into what I've just told you about the story for oxygen? So here's what you need to know. Hemoglobin takes oxygen out of solution. And so oxygen that is not in solution, not in aqueous form, does not count towards the partial pressure of oxygen in that solution. So the overall consequence of an animal having hemoglobin in its blood, taking oxygen out of solution, is that blood can effectively hold more dissolved oxygen, right? Because any oxygen that is bound to hemoglobin is not counting towards the oxygen partial pressure in that blood. So an important conclusion from this is that it's only gas molecules that exist as free gas molecules that will contribute to a gas partial pressure in solution. And we will see lots of examples of animals taking advantage of this property to facilitate the movement of gases through their bodies. right? So another way of putting this is that bound oxygen, so bound to hemoglobin, won't impact the oxygen partial pressure or the direction of diffusion. So collectively, that all takes care of direction, but it does not yet help us appreciate or understand the rate of diffusion, so how fast gases will travel. So for thinking about the rate of diffusion, we've got another equation to investigate. This equation is known as Fick's law after Adolf Eugen Fick, who is responsible for originally describing and characterizing it. And the Fick's equation looks like this. So J is equal to A delta C times D, all divided by distance. I could give you another variable for distance, but I don't really see much of a point in handing you extra variables. So just think distance or thickness for our denominator here. So let's look at the other parameters in this equation. So in this instance, A is equal to the area across which diffusion is occurring, right? So think, for example, about the diving beetle with its gas bubble, right? That air bubble has a substantial surface area, right? That might have something to do with facilitating the rate of diffusion. Delta C here is given as our concentration gradient in moles. However, I'll note that we can replace delta C with delta P. So it depending on what substance you're talking about, if you're talking about a dissolved substance, you can use delta C. If you're talking about a gas, you can use delta P. The important component of that is that it is related to the gradient between which a substance is moving, right? So if you have a steeper partial pressure gradient or a steeper concentration gradient, you will see faster diffusion. If you have a small gradient, you will see slower diffusion. And then the last coefficient in this equation is one that's worth talking about a little bit more. That's the diffusion constant. Okay. Let's first think about the rate of diffusion in air. So here are three substances that travel through air. You will note that I've also listed out the molecular weights of these substances, and I've listed out the D coefficient for these substances in air. So although they behave similarly, their speed of movement through air differs and varies, right? So water has a higher D, so faster diffusion coefficient constant. Oxygen and carbon dioxide have smaller diffusion constants, right? And they also have much greater molecular weights. And so this is the general principle to keep in mind, is that molecules that are larger are going to move more slowly through air. Okay, so we can now use this equation to investigate, carry out a thought experiment of how long would it take a molecule of water, carbon dioxide, and oxygen to each move a total distance of 1 centimeter in air. Coming back to this slide, right, if we're trying to figure out how far or how long it would take to move 1 centimeter in air, we can do that just by studying the diffusion constants for each of these substances, right? So for water, our diffusion constant is 0.24. And right, this is given in units of centimeter per second, right? So if we want to figure out how long it would take, we can divide that constant by a centimeter or to figure out how long it's going to take water to travel the distance of 1 centimeter. So 1 divided by 0.24 gives us 4.17 seconds. We can do similar math now for oxygen. Right, so 1 over 0.195 is going to give us 5.12 seconds. And same thing for oxygen, or for carbon dioxide. 1 over 0.15 is 6.66 seconds. All right, so just have these numbers in mind as we continue through here. All right, so this is one molecule of water, carbon dioxide or oxygen, just moving 1 centimeter in air. Okay, so it's going to take 4 seconds for each of these substances, 4 to 6 seconds for these substances to move that kind of distance. Now let's look at how these diffusion constants look in water compared to air. And notice in this place, I'm not comparing water moving in water, because that doesn't entirely make sense. So instead, I've added in glucose as another substance for us to consider. So here are our diffusion coefficients in water. So for oxygen, we were at 0.195 square centimeters per second in air. In water, we're now at 2.5 times 10 to the negative fifth square centimeters per second for movement, right? So hopefully you're now thinking in terms of orders of magnitude. That is much, much, much slower through water compared to air. And these values are similar for carbon dioxide and glucose, right? 10 to the negative fifth for both of those. So if we were to repeat our question, how long would it take a molecule of carbon dioxide or oxygen to each move a total distance of 1 centimeter in water? Now what we're looking at doing is for oxygen, 1 divided by 2.5 times 10 to the negative fifth, right? So again, if you're dividing by 10 to the negative fifth, you're going to, if you bring that into the numerator, that's going to be 10 to the fifth. So if we divide 1 divided by 2.5, so we're going to get 0.4 times 10 to the fifth, right? And 10 to the fifth is, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Did I do that right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And then if it's 0.4, we're going to wind up getting 40,000 seconds, right, for a molecule of oxygen to travel 1 centimeter through water. So that's 40,000 seconds in minutes or hours. So 40,000 divided by 60. So that's going to be 666 minutes. Let's divide that by 60 minutes in an hour. So that's going to be 11.1 hours to move 1 centimeter through water. Right? I hope that helps to highlight how much more slowly oxygen is moving in water compared to how quickly it can move in air. 5 seconds versus 11 hours to travel a distance of 1 centimeter. That is a dramatic difference, right? And if you just divide one of these by the other, essentially, regardless of what substance you're talking about, diffusion rates are 10,000 times faster in air compared to water. So let's actually go back to an example that I brought up in our introduction, which is thinking about conditions for a mouse that's living in a burrow. One thing I didn't tell you about this particular mouse species is that they're found in soil that's pretty sandy. And the reason that's important is the sandy soil will actually contain a lot of air in between sand grains, right? And just looking at these calculations for diffusion rates of gases in air, we can now recognize that it's actually pretty easy for air to diffuse around, right, into the surrounding soil and back out again and into and out of the mouse. Okay, so for a mouse that's found in a burrow, it really isn't much of a challenge to get oxygen. However, if the soil around a mouse's burrow starts to get really waterlogged, circumstances are going to change pretty dramatically. Because the diffusion of gases is so much slower through aqueous solutions, that can start to cause real problems for a mouse in a waterlogged burrow. And this is, in fact, the exact same reason why, when it rains out and soils get really waterlogged, you start to see earthworms come to the surface, right? They cannot breathe. They cannot access oxygen when soil is waterlogged because it moves too slowly to get into their tissues. So if you do some more extensive math, and physiologists have done this for us, that our general conclusion is that diffusion through a tissue can only meet oxygen requirements across distances that are less than around 1 millimeter, right? Even 5 seconds is a pretty long time for something to move, right? So for oxygens to get to tissues, animals can only rely on simple diffusion if the distance of oxygen travel is less than 1 millimeter. Right, so now picture a millimeter in your mind for a second as I say this. So that's how far oxygen can make it on its own. So clearly we are thicker than 1 millimeter. So we are clearly doing something other than only relying on simple diffusion for the movement of oxygen into our tissues. So this brings us to our next major question for this topic. What do animals do when diffusion won't work? And the answer to this question is animals do something known as bulk flow. And this is really an alternate term, again from the world of physics, for convection, right? So this refers to movements of masses of air or of water, right, to transport gases within that mass of air or water, right? So again, it's bulk flow or convection. And pretty soon we're going to see examples of two major types of bulk flow. So bulk flow can be either unidirectional. We can picture that as being like air or a liquid, moving through a pipe in a single direction. Or bulk flow can be tidal in nature. So there can be mechanisms that move air or water into a compartment and then back out again. So that would be tidal. And so we finally now set the stage for thinking about the full picture for how animals deliver oxygen to their tissues and how they remove carbon dioxide from their tissues and from their mitochondria. The entire picture is animals use a combination of diffusion and convection, or bulk flow, and diffusion and convection alternate in series to transport gases. It's often simplest to start out thinking about this in ourselves, right? So when we breathe in air into our lungs, right, we're relying on convection or bulk flow to move air into our lungs for the most part. Within the lungs, at the level of the alveoli, we then rely on the process of diffusion to move air from the air phase inside of the alveoli into the bloodstream and into blood vessels. Okay, so that's our next diffusion step. From there, blood is then pumped through the body, right, with the help of the heart, and that whole process is another process of bulk flow, right, to transport the oxygen in that blood to the tissues. And then as blood arrives at tissues, we then rely on simple diffusion, again, to move oxygen from a blood vessel into a cell and then into that cell's mitochondria, right? So this is a very short distance of less than a millimeter to enable simple diffusion to work. So this brings us to the end of our chapter and a picture of what's known as the oxygen cascade, which is simply a map of what happens with regards to oxygen partial pressures as we investigate oxygen levels found across different substances and tissues. Right? So if we look at the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere, in atmospheric air, it's generally going to be around 0.2 or 21% oxygen. If we look at the level of the alveoli in the lungs, and we'll come back to this, notice that there's a partial pressure gradient between atmospheric air and the alveoli. So that's going to help favor movement of oxygen into the alveoli, thanks to that gradient. If we then look at the partial pressure of oxygen in arterial blood, notice there's not a huge difference in partial pressure differences here. That's because alveolar blood, our arterial blood leaving the alveoli will be almost fully oxygenated, right? But there's enough of a gradient that it will favor movement into arterial blood. And then if we look at the level of tissue capillaries, again, we see a lower oxygen partial pressure, right? So collectively favoring movement into the capillaries. But there is a very large partial pressure gradient between capillaries into the mitochondria. So that's going to favor simple diffusion of oxygen into the mitochondria. So let's wrap up this topic just by talking about why life is especially hard for ocean fish. And I love this picture of this ocean blobfish. I think when they're swimming around, they don't look quite as sad, but it does a very good job of looking sad here. So life is hard for ocean fish, first and foremost, because the diffusion rate of gases is very slow, right, as we saw down here in ocean water. So that's kind of strike one against life for ocean fish. Along with that, water is much more dense and viscous than air is, right? So if we think about, the amount of energy that it takes to wave around some air compared to the amount of energy that it takes to wave around some water, all right, we're very aware of how much more viscous water is. So it takes much more energy to flow water across a gas exchange surface if that's the environmental medium that you're found in. And if we also revisit what we know about gas solubility as temperature and salinity go up, I think we can help to reach some conclusions about under which conditions we think life is going to be the hardest for fish. Right. So again, if we're just looking at concentrations at a range of different temperatures, comparing air, freshwater, and seawater, right, the concentration of oxygen is much, much higher in air than it is in fresh or seawater. Right, and the concentration of oxygen drops as temperature and as salinity increase, right? And if you do the math, you'll see that the concentration of oxygen in seawater is just 1/40th of the concentration of oxygen in air, right? So that's going to make it just more challenging to survive if your survival is dependent on making sure that you can get access to energy. And this dramatic difference between air and water has a lot of implications for the animals that are found in these environments. It's a pretty clear hypothesis for why the highest absolute metabolic rates among animals are found in air breathers, right? So we saw this example of the hummingbird earlier on, moving very quickly, and it has an exceptionally high metabolic rate. If you were to try to develop an aqueous hummingbird, you'd run into problems, right? Because that hummingbird would have a very hard time obtaining enough oxygen, right? So some of the major differences we observe between animals in terrestrial and aquatic environments are because of the challenge of obtaining oxygen in those aqueous environments. So that brings us to the end of this topic, and just to give you a preview of what we'll pick up on Wednesday, we're going to go straight from these general principles that come from physics into an investigation of external respiration. So we're going to learn about the physiology of breathing. And here are pictures of two really fun organisms for thinking about the physiology of breathing. On the left, we've got a mud puppy that has a set of external gills. And on the right, we have an example of a fish known as the climbing perch. And this fish actually has two breathing organs, both gills and also a type of lung. So we're going to see lots of really neat stuff as we get into this next topic. But in the meantime, I hope that you're able to get out and enjoy some of the snow, and I will look forward to seeing you very soon.